Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we try to take the time to do deep dives on great theories of everything. Grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, mostly from obscure sources. And today is our 199th video under the rubric of the Reciprocal Church, where we're putting together kind of not well-known resources for you to build your own spirit within you by the practices that you do, the studies that you've undertaken. So we did a long section on the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which goes into everything about meditation, not necessarily Buddhism, but mostly, the focus on meditation. And it's two different styles, two different kinds, two different purposes. Then we looked at some creative music that has the potential to bring out spirit, ecstatic music, creative music. And we've been deconstructing a lot of the Western stuff also, to shed light on the fact that this syncretic process of putting together religious practice is very much needed at this point in time, because the old religious systems are about to die out and collapse because they are fraudulent, and people are starting to recognize that. And pretty much as soon as you recognize it, you need to get out. But especially we've been looking in terms of the New Testament. We've been doing a lot of decoding of aspects of the New Testament and preparing to decode the book of Luke. I actually just got this book today from Michael Menescott called The Origin of Christianity, and haven't really had time to dig into it. I've read most of it because most of it is on his website in various articles. But I'm trying to see how he pieces it together and where his thinking has been going in the last couple of years since these other articles have come out, or last year at least. We'll be digging into that. But right now we're looking at a little pamphlet that was put out by Abelard Rushlin back in 1979, and he's like the earliest modern source I know of for this. Many people from history have known that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars, in particular Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, which are known as the Flavian dynasty, from 69 to 96 AD. And they employed a fella named Josephus. And Josephus not only wrote his two histories called The Jewish Wars and The Antiquities of the Jews, but if you read them together with the Gospels, you also recognize that he wrote those. And this author is saying that Josephus was a pen name for a guy named Calpurnius Piso. His father wrote the book of Mark back in about 60 AD. And the main purpose was that he had married into the Herod family, and the Herods were the puppet kings of Palestine during the first centuries BC and AD. And there were many different Herods, but he married the sister of uh, uh, I'm not sure, Aristobulus, maybe one of them, and I think Herod's granddaughter or something like that. And so they were trying to create a Prince of Peace among the Jews, so that they would stop all of their uh, you know, insurrections and revolutionary activity, and even a lot of the violence, and also just be better Roman citizens. Or I mean, they weren't Roman citizens, but at least better Roman, colonials. Um, you know, to just stop being so xenophobic and um, set in your ways and unwilling to worship new gods and unwilling to um, you know to praise Caesar, and having to have all of these uh, kosher practices. And they were just sick and tired of it, because all of the rest of their colonies didn't have this kind of difficult to maintain um, character. The Jews were by far their worst and most difficult to deal with colony, from what I understand. And they ended up having to fight this war against them that lasted for 7 years. And Titus and Vespasian were the generals in the war. Both of them were injured, wounded in the war. So that came a little bit earlier, but I mean a little bit later, for this guy Piso. But so Piso also wrote the autobiography of Josephus, where he kind of goes over Josephus's story, and you find out that according, Josephus being a fictional character also, he was supposed to be one of the generals for the Jews in this war, and eventually surrendered to Vespasian, and gave Vespasian the star prophecy where he said that you're going to become the emperor someday. And because he did that, and then he transferred he transferred allegiance. He defected over to the Romans because he believed that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And Vespasian adopted him into his family as his own son, for giving him the star prophecy and having it fulfilled when Vespasian became emperor, and brought him to Rome and made him the court historian. And Christians will say, oh, well, Josephus is a corroborating secular witness to Jesus having lived. And they also use Tacitus for the same purpose. First of all, Josephus and Tacitus both lived several generations after the so-called Jesus was supposed to have lived. But also, Josephus, and more importantly, Josephus and Tacitus were both agents of the Roman government. And Josephus actually wrote the entire War of the Jews, which came out in the 70s, and didn't mention Jesus, even though he should have been part of the story at some point or another, because he goes all the way back to 150 BC, or more. And so he should have mentioned him in the War of the Jews, but did not. He does not mention him until an offhanded paragraph in Antiquities of the Jews, which came out in the 90s. So that's the earliest mention of Jesus in any work. And then Tacitus, I believe, was writing in the early 2nd century. I'm not completely sure of that, but he's also an adjunct member of the Flavian, court, the imperial court. So we are trying to, that's kind of the basic background of what he's talking about here. we're going to take over where we left off last time, and just he's kind of showing the basic context by which this guy Piso is uh, writing these books. And he claims that Piso wrote so much different stuff, including like the entire New Testament, but also like the Apocrypha, um, the Greek Apocrypha, and had some of them translated into Hebrew by force. He forced some, um, Jewish rabbis to to put his editorial work into their Hebrew texts. And he also claims that, again, many of the authors that you're familiar with knew what this game was, and they wrote about it in their work, including William Shakespeare, who, as one of the other authors in this whole same vein, Joseph Atwill talks about, it was probably this woman named Amelia Bassano. And every one of Shakespeare's plays is about the topic of the Romans and the Jews and how the Romans wrote the Gospels. It's a reversal of the Gospels, really. It's a mockery. This is a mockery as well. The Piso family wrote the Gospels basically to mollify the Jews, or really to mellow out the Jews, but also to mock them, and then to eventually mock the slaves and the Roman soldiers and other lowlifes, or hoi polloi, that they'd look down upon, and get them to follow this religion where you believe in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking an extra mile with the soldier's backpack, and believing that the Roman centurion has greater faith than all of Israel, and a number of other, kind of poison pills that Jesus puts into the equation, including including not chastising the Roman soldier for not for not being satisfied with their pay. So that kind of stuff is pretty interesting. Why would that be there? Okay, so we'll start right here. More vengeance was wrought by Piso by his picturing the Jews in the successive Gospels as increasingly evil. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus repeatedly calls the scribes and Pharisees hypocrites and even vipers, but does not include the people. In Matthew 3, verse 7, also the Pharisees and Sadducees are called offspring of vipers, this time by John the Baptist. But by the time of Luke chapter 3, it is not merely the leaders but the crowds whom John the Baptist calls the offspring of vipers. And in Acts 23, verse 12, it is the Jews, and not quote, the Jews, and not merely the Pharisees or Sadducees who form a conspiracy to kill Paul. By the time of the Gospel of John, Acts was written, he says, around 96 to 100, whereas John was written in 105 or so, according to him. The author, Piso's son, Justus, has Jesus tell the Jews who challenge him, "You are of your father, the devil," in John 8, chapter 8, verse 44. Even when Piso absolves the villains of culpability, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," it is the Roman soldiers and not the Jews whom he excuses. That's in Luke 23, verse 34. It was true that none of the actors knew what, because none of the fictional characters could be present to observe the writing of the story. The New Testament pictures the Jews as enemies of Jesus, of Paul, and of the message of the gospel. Piso's son, Proculus, writing the epistle to the Romans in chapter 11, verse 28, explained the reason why the Jews were being pictured as the enemies of the new believers. Quote, as concerning the gospel, the Jews are enemies because of you, or for your sakes. That is, in order that the people would believe the story. The author of 1st and 2nd John admits why the Jews were then opposing the gospel. They were refusing to confess that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh. The author's response was to label such opponents as deceivers and antichrist. Okay, that's the end of that section. The next section is called The Authorship of the New Testament Books. The main authors of the New Testament books were Arius Calpurnius Piso, otherwise known as Josephus, among other pseudonyms that he takes, his son, Fabius Justus, his granddaughter's husband, Pliny the Younger, and his son, Julius. I believe that is Calpurnius Piso's son, Julius, not Pliny's. Following is a list of actual authorship of each of the books of the New Testament. He says, the original Mark came out in 60 AD from Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was executed by Nero in 65 AD. As part of Nero, there was a palace coup or something, and he was implicated in it. I believe he was guilty of trying to assassinate Nero, and so he was executed as part of that. I believe Cicero was executed at the same time. Cicero was originally Nero's tutor. Okay, then Matthew was written 70 to 75 by Arius Calpurnius Piso. The new Mark, 75 to 80 by Arius Calpurnius Piso. Luke was written between 85 and 90 by Arius Calpurnius Piso, with Pliny's help. John, written in 105 by Justus Calpurnius Piso, the son, the oldest son. Acts of the Apostles, between 96 and 100. Chapters 1 through 15 were written by Arius Calpurnius Piso with Justus's help. Chapters 16 and 17 were written by Justus. Chapters 18 through 28, some written by Justus, some by Pliny. And then Romans was written in 100 by Proculus Calpurnius Piso. 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians were written between 100 and 103 by Pliny the Younger. 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Ephesians, I guess, and Colossians were written, just those two, written 103 to 105 by Justus. Colossians was written 106 to 107 by Justus with his son Julianus's help. And 1 Timothy 105 by Pliny the Younger. 2 Timothy 107 by Justus. Titus was written by Pliny in 103 to 105. Philemon was written by Justus with help of Julianus, 105 to 110. James was written in 110 by Justus. 1st and 2nd Peter were written 110 to 115 by Proculus. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written 110 to 115 by Julius Calpurnius Piso, the younger son of Arius Calpurnius Piso. Jude was written between 110 and 115 by Julius also. Revelation was written 136 to 137 by Julius, so there was like a 20-year gap there. And then Hebrews finally was written in 140 by Flavius Arrian, younger grandson of Piso. I guess from Claudia Phoebe, who I believe was Calpurnius Piso's wife. Okay, but there's plenty else that he wrote, more than just the Gospels and Josephus. The Church Fathers, he wrote. Between 100 and 105, additional Christian books were already being done by the same authors who were finishing the New Testament itself. Julius wrote an epistle as Clement of Rome, who I believe was like the second or maybe third pope behind Peter. And he was also a Flavian. Or, apparently he didn't exist, but that's what history tells us about him. Clement of Rome. I believe he was, I think they say he was executed by Domitian for being a Christian, and that would have been before that. So not really sure what he's saying there, but he might flesh it out later on. Pliny the Younger wrote a number of epistles as Saint Ignatius. Proclus wrote one as Saint Polycarp. By these are all first and second and third century, Christian fathers. By these writings, the authors were installing themselves in their own time as the legitimate successors of the apostles Peter and Paul, who had supposedly written in the middle of the past century. This facade entitled them, as they now went among their new believers, to be the legitimate propagandizers and interpreters of the Christian writings. The Pisos also wrote were responsible for the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. The story is it's supposed to be going back to like the 3rd century BC or 300 BC that the Ptolemies, which were a dynasty of Egyptian, but they were really Greeks. They were the family of one of Alexander the Great's generals, and they ruled Egypt in this period. And they sent for a bunch of Jewish scholars to come to Egypt and put the Bible into Greek, put the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And the story is that 12 from each, or maybe it was maybe 6 from each one of the 12 tribes, or I'm not sure, but it was supposed to be 72 or 70 of them. These Jewish scholars went, and that's why it's called the Septuagint after 70. So anyway, Father Piso too was busy. Piso was amending the Greek Septuagint. In his Gospels, he had strengthened his story by misquoting places from the Hebrew Scriptures. He changed the language in the Septuagint to make it conform with the New Testament misquotes. That way, there would be an alleged correct translation of the Hebrew Scriptures with which the New Testament quotations agreed. Also, the Apocrypha. Piso wished to create a strong foundation on which to place the new faith. So between 100 and 115, he recreated the story of the 400 lost years of Jewish history, which are the ones between the last prophet and Jesus. So that is from, I think, the time of Esther. And so that's supposed to be 400 years. There's also 400 lost years of Jewish history between the Genesis and Exodus, basically, between the time that Joseph goes down there to Egypt and the time that Moses comes back is covered in a split second. So anyway, he did this by also writing the 14 books of the Apocrypha, including Esdras, First Maccabees, Judith, Tobit, Bel, and the Dragon, and by making Jewish history brave and glorious, but not over the Romans, over the Greeks and over the Syrians, or the Seleucids. By making Jewish history brave and glorious, the empire's peoples would more readily accept it as their own history and become the new Israel. Also, the writings of Arian, later between 130 and 150, Arianus, a longer form of his grandfather's name Arius, would emulate him. He would use Piso's pseudonyms of Flavius and Barnabas, and he would compose, in addition to Hebrews, many Christian books: The Shepherd of Hermas, Barnabas, the Didache, Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Epistle to Diogenes, it's Diognetus, as well as 24 volumes on Roman history, on account of Alexander's campaign into India, the writings of the purported astronomer Ptolemy, and the lecture notes of Epictetus, his Stoic instructor, whom he created. We probably won't read all of this, but he also says that he wrote Aristotle, that Aristotle was just this minor guy who did a little bit of, I believe, natural history or something, and he turned Aristotle into this giant Greek, student of Plato who wrote on every subject. He also, it's claimed that the inner circle, or whoever knew about this, however this was passed on, that they also wrote the Quran. And the Quran has all of the 10 of the same characters from the New Testament, including Jesus, Zechariah, John the Baptist, Mary, Satan. He invented Satan also, because there really isn't a Satan in the Old Testament. And I believe in the handful of places that there are references to Satan, it's not like this Hollywood version of Satan. It's more like a Satan, an obstructor, or a person who's an obstruction. But I think the main, there are only like 5 references to Satan in the Hebrew scriptures, and I think a couple of them were inserted by Piso, if he's right about his theory. A couple of them were inserted into by him forcing these rabbis to put the Septuagint, his writings of the Septuagint, then back into Hebrew. Like, so he had it translated into Greek so he could read it. And then he altered it and then had them put it back into Hebrew. But he also was part of the Herod family, and so the Herods knew Hebrew. And so he had some guidance in being able to understand the Hebrew scriptures. It wasn't like he had to get it into Greek in order to understand any of it, but he wanted to be able to read the whole thing, without having to be constantly consulting the Herods on it. So anyway, he gets into a section here that is called the numerical code systems, and he shows the codes that they used, which are kind of like their autographs or their copyrights of the different books. And so Piso inserts his numbers into these books. His main numbers are like 14 and 26, 60, 41, and 46, I think. There's a few other ones that are used. Josephus's number is 36. Pliny's number is, I can't remember what Pliny's number is, but they insert these numbers not only into the chapters and verses, but into the narrative itself, and into the sometimes even into the amount of characters or the amount of generations, in the genealogies. And he goes over it in pretty great detail, how the Greek alphabet is numbered and then how they added them up. It's actually a little bit too technical for me to kind of read it. But I'm also a little bit skeptical of the numerology, because they're just, the odds are not nearly as high as what these authors talk about, where they're like, oh my gosh, it's almost, it's almost like, oh my gosh, he used 14. And it's like, well, the chances are 1 in 14, or, whatever, maybe a little bit less than that, but he's going to use some number. So it's, and he's always using exclamation points to, tell you how important it is that this particular number came up. And it's like, well, he's got about 6 different numbers, it's, the odds aren't that, they're not big enough for you to be using an exclamation point. But he is also, this is probably the only author that I've ever read that uses exclamation points all the time that doesn't really annoy me, because some of this stuff is so explosive that it's like, okay, that deserves an exclamation point. I think I wrote in my first book that I wrote, I think I had either 1 or 2 exclamation points in the whole book. He's probably got like 300 in his book. But I had a couple exclamation points that were quotations, parts of quotations. But so anyway, again, I'm rambling, but it's probably somebody probably will get some value out of it at some point. Maybe me when I listen to it again. The next section that we're going to get into is called Sounds, Animals, and Illusions. So this is some of the more other coding that they use to kind of sign their name to these things. Usually they don't want them to be discovered at the time, but they want them to be discovered in history. And they were. And like I said, Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, Cervantes, so many of these other authors knew about this stuff. All right, thanks for tuning in.